Now continuing on, here's our exact same object, but our layout has been changed to our UV edit mode, our 3D Paint UV edit mode, and that's from this little tab right up here. And if you take a look, I've got my objects, materials, and colors, I've got attributes, and then the UV mapping tab. Okay, so we've got our same UV map applied. It's an editable object. And if I go to materials, you'll see that I've got my material and my paint, kind of like I showed you in the first video. And over here is where I can actually edit this UV map and work with it a little bit more. So if I just say show UV mesh, pull this out here, that's what I get. It doesn't really look like much. Well, that's because my texture is not loaded. Okay, so make sure I select this texture over here, go to texture and say load textures, and it pulls that map in, and when I select it I can see it up there. If I go to this guy right here, this is my UV polygon tag, and what I can do with that is select that entire UV map. Okay, and what can I do with that? Well, if I click and drag, I'm now actually moving that entire map around. Okay, so if you've got a large texture on here, a bump map for a face, or a grunge map that's going on a wall or something, you can adjust it right here in this view. Now you have to understand that this view here does not mean your object itself is unwrapped. Okay, let's just turn that image off for a minute. What that means is it's a representation, almost like a map. So if you were ever using models or building models or putting together a toy car for a child, or maybe when you remember when you were a kid, you had a big roll of stickers that came with this model or came with the toy car or the bike. And all those stickers were laid out on that big, huge piece of paper before you stuck them on all over the car. That's kind of what a UV map is in a way. It is all of the image maps unwrapped for the object. So this wireframe representation is just that. It's a representation of where things will lay out on the model, whether it be a face or a platonic object like this. Okay. Well, how do you determine how it's laid out? Well, that's all down here in the projection areas. Okay, so here's a projection tab under the UV mapping tab. Okay, and if I choose sphere, well, suddenly that entire object is spread out, like it's split open. So if you ever see a map of the world and it's kind of curved up at the top ends, it looks a little funky on the sides, somewhat similar to this, well, if you put it all together, it seams together perfectly. In many sense, that's what this is. Okay. Now the mapping we had was working just fine for it, but I just wanted to show you how the other mapping methods can change based on the geometry. Okay, and again, this is just a representation of how this is being unwrapped. Okay, something like this could actually be useful, and you can actually click right on here and still move that map around. Okay, but depending on what you're trying to accomplish, your projection method might vary. Here's an example of, let's say you had that model car. This is actually how those stickers might be laid out. So what can you do with this in BodyPaint if you wanted? Well, let's go back to our sphere, because one of the most common methods is this unwrapped type version like this. Although you can see here that probably not the best method for this. Okay. If I go to my 3D Paint tab here, got my brush, we'll go to our Paint Setup Wizard, and we've got our textures and our objects, so we can actually run through here just using all the default materials, and you can see that now an entirely new UV map has been created from that wizard, rather than using the default one that was created with the platonic object. I can still come down here for the projection, choose my UV Edit tool, and change it to sphere and get back to where I was, or cylinder, or one of the others. But the fact that I have that when I go to 3D painting is that I can actually just paint right on here. And let me put my texture back on. I'll select that guy, and I'll say texture, UV map. And you can see that I'm painting right on that map. If I come over here to brushes, I can open up some presets, go to standard tools, choose one like this. That could work out just great for us. We'll select the brush icon right in here, and we can choose, a different color, for instance. Paint some red on there, change the blue, and so on. All right, but if we come in here and you look closely, you can paint within each one of those areas for a very specific coloring. Okay, and we're just using a default model here, of course, but let's say you had a face and you wanted to create some interesting shading on there. You could change the color here, put bags under somebody's eyes, and so on. Okay, so using just the simple body paint tools, kind of like I showed you in the first video, along with the UV map, you can actually create some really interesting textures. Not, of course, like this, our little example, but you can really do some neat things. But again, it all depends on the model. And not every model requires this. And in fact, most everyday models and textures and animations you create don't necessarily require using UV maps. Okay, so hopefully that gave you a little bit explanation. I've seen a lot of things that are out there, and I think they might be a little bit confusing. So hopefully this just explained things a little bit better for you. Just consider this model when you're working with UV. Just consider it unwrapped so that you can paint on it flat, and that painted image is then wrapped back around that model so that everything applies evenly rather than streaking and stretching.